You never expect it to happen to you. Divorce always seems like something that happens to others, not you, especially when you trust and love your partner. Yet, when you see the statistics today, it makes you wonder if marriage is even worth it. Promises like, "till death do us part," feel empty, their meaning fading over time. Perhaps I should have noticed the warning signs earlier, through stories, advice, or simply paying closer attention. Love has a way of blinding us, making flaws less noticeable. Even with a family and a shared life, the idea of growing old together started to feel unsettling. The truth is, the signs were there all along. I grew up in a household that became a single-parent home. As a child, my parents' marriage seemed strong. My father worked hard to support us, sacrificing his health and time. My mother, meanwhile, returned to work after my younger sister started school. Back then, we kids had no idea of what was brewing beneath the surface. Her affair didn't start immediately, but by the time I was a teenager, it was undeniable. It unfolded like so many do. Late work hours, sudden business trips, and an increased focus on her appearance. Without smartphones, the clues were subtle. Mysterious calls, unexplained absences, and excuses that didn't add up. My father found out when he came home early one day, hoping to surprise her. She'd said she was shopping and getting her hair done, but instead, he found her car in the driveway, alongside her boss's. He walked in through the back door and caught them in the act. Furious, he confronted the man, Michael Reed, and physically threw him out of the house. Unfortunately, this discovery meant little in a no-fault divorce system. My father couldn't evict her from their shared home, and she refused to leave. He eventually moved out, though it meant losing the home he'd worked so hard for. I was livid with my mother and made my feelings clear, but my younger siblings didn't fully understand what was happening. That year, my mother continued to arrange visits with our father, who was deeply affected. He confided in me, saying that we were his only reason to keep going. He dreamed of gaining custody, but the system was stacked against him. My desire to live with him didn't matter, as the courts favored my mother due to my siblings' ages. One small relief for my father was that Australia didn't have harsh alimony laws like the US. Spousal maintenance wasn't an issue, and with my mother earning well, his child support payments were reasonable. Still, the years after the divorce were incredibly difficult. My resentment toward my mother grew stronger. I sabotaged her relationships with any new suitor, making it clear how much I despised her. By the time I was 16, I couldn't take it anymore and moved out, leaving her in tears. I didn't care at the time. We barely spoke after that. My father, on the other hand, rebuilt his life with a woman named Grace, who became a loving figure to us. Though he didn't want to remarry, they were happy together. At 18, I left my mother's house for good, cutting ties completely. My parting words to her were bitter, reflecting years of frustration. She cried as I left, but I didn't look back. Before going, I promised my siblings I'd stay in touch and reassured them that everything would be fine. This experience shaped how I viewed relationships. I became cautious with women, determined to avoid the mistakes my father endured. I knew I was loyal and sought the same in a partner. Stories of infidelity haunted me, and I spent hours reading about how to protect myself from similar heartbreak. After high school, I dated casually but carefully, always on the lookout for someone trustworthy. By the time I was 21, I was working as an engineer and taking night classes to advance my career. It was around this time that I met Sophie, a recent university graduate. We met at a corporate event where I was representing my engineering firm. Sophie, working as a part-time sales rep for another company, immediately caught my eye. By the end of the day, I had her number. When I told my roommate, Chris, about her, he teased me. "Got a hot date lined up, Ethan?" "Something like that," I replied. "Is this the girl from the conference?" "Yeah." Just trying not to seem too eager. When I called her a few days later, she was thrilled and eager to meet up. I felt confident as I got ready, despite being on a budget. We decided on a local bar for our first date. Dinner felt like too much for a first meeting. I wasn't interested in being someone's free meal ticket. When I arrived, I spotted her sitting at the bar with a drink in hand. She smiled when she saw me, and my heart skipped a beat. Over drinks, we got to know each other. Sophie admitted that her job mostly hired her for her looks, which had attracted attention from married men. She found it disgusting, and I understood her frustration. Knowing about my mother's infidelity, I always thought cheating was a gendered issue. But after researching online, I realized both men and women are equally guilty. I was stunned by the statistics, with so many admitting to affairs. Articles even claimed Australians had a reputation as notorious cheaters. "You were such a gentleman," Sophie said one night, holding my hand. "You kept eye contact, stayed professional, and waited until the right moment to ask for my number. You were genuine. I just wish you were single." I assured her I was, and even vouched for myself through my friends. She smiled, trusting me, though she admitted she'd been hurt before. We started slow, meeting for coffee or drinks over the first few weeks. By our third night out, we shared our first kiss, having already bonded over family stories. It felt right for both of us. Things moved naturally after that. Coffee turned to dinner, and within a week, we spent the night together. A month later, Sophie told me she loved me, and I felt the same. Despite my father's troubled past with relationships, Sophie had earned my trust and my heart. As she secured a stable job, we started discussing bigger steps, moving in together, buying a house, starting a family. We decided to purchase a home before getting married, lucky to avoid Australia's housing boom. But her poor credit history prevented her from co-signing the mortgage. My father stepped in to co-borrow, saving the day. Sophie was deeply grateful to him, and her parents adored me. 3 months after moving into our house, I proposed. Our engagement and wedding plans brought joy to everyone around us. Marrying Sophie was the happiest day of my life. We exchanged vows in a park, surrounded by friends and family, grinning as we committed to each other. Our honeymoon was a week on a Pacific island, and it was during this trip we discovered Sophie was pregnant. 9 months later, our daughter arrived, followed by a son 18 months later. Deciding 2 kids were enough, Sophie chose birth control instead of surgery. She balanced part-time work with motherhood until both kids entered middle school, then returned to full-time work. By our mid-40s, I had become a regional manager, which required frequent travel, while Sophie ran her own real estate office, occasionally heading into the city headquarters. Our daughter eventually moved in with her boyfriend, and our son began university. Married for over 20 years, I still loved Sophie deeply. I could admire other women, sure, but my heart was always hers. I never strayed. Still, my father's experience with infidelity haunted me. I should have been more observant, more vigilant, especially when the signs began to appear. The truth crept in slowly, until I could no longer ignore it. "Do you think she's cheating?" I asked Chris one evening. "Come on, man. She adores you," he replied, looking at me like I was crazy. I thought things would improve after Ryan left her office, but her behavior, it reminds me of my mother. The thought of her, my mother, made my blood boil. I'd barely spoken to her in decades, except for her occasional texts asking about her rarely seen grandchildren. She only attended my wedding because my father, now happily married to Grace, had insisted I invite her. Sophie understood my bitterness and never pushed me to reconnect. "What's your plan if she's cheating?" Chris asked. "Gather evidence and leave. I'll meet with a private investigator Monday." "I don't need photos, just proof," I said. "It's a shame infidelity isn't grounds for divorce anymore," Chris muttered, patting my shoulder. "True, but being prepared helps. At least the kids are grown, and there are things in our life she's overlooked that could work in my favor." That night, I visited my dad. When he saw my troubled expression, he handed me a beer and patiently waited for me to open up. Dad and Grace, still so in love after all these years, were a reminder of what relationships could be when they worked. "Dad, I think Sophie's cheating," I finally admitted. Grace sighed softly. "Not again." I nodded grimly. "The signs are there, the same ones you told me about, Dad. She's smart, though, like she's read a manual on how to hide an affair. But I've caught on." "What's the plan?" Dad asked, his tone serious. "I'm transferring the house to you," I explained. "Sophie's not on the mortgage, so legally, we own it. Once I remove my name from the deed, she'll just be a tenant. After the divorce, we'll sign a lease agreement. If I have to, I'll evict her." Grace looked at me, concerned. "Have you really thought this through?" I took a long sip of my beer, frustration bubbling under the surface. She knew the terms of our marriage. If she's unfaithful, she's out. No alimony, no financial support. I refused to fund a cheater. Returning home, Sophie greeted me warmly from the couch. "Where were you?" she asked casually. "Just talked to Dad about a job," I lied. Though her behavior was suspicious, I still lacked concrete proof. If she was cheating, it wasn't with someone she saw daily. My biggest fear was the sudden appearance of late nights or girls' trips. For now, she assured me of her love, but doubt lingered. The idea of Sophie betraying me left a knot in my stomach, but without proof, I forced myself to trust her cautiously. Monday arrived, and I carried on with our usual routine, breakfast and affectionate exchanges before heading to work, though my mind was preoccupied with my plans to meet a private investigator during lunch. It felt surreal, like stepping into an old detective movie, to be hiring someone to follow my wife after 2 decades of marriage. The PI greeted me with a professional demeanor and a reassuring smile before diving into the details. "Why do you suspect an affair?" she asked. I explained my history, recounting my mother's betrayal and my father's heartbreak, then laid out the subtle but troubling changes I'd noticed in Sophie. "It's not blatant," I said, trying to sound casual, "but there are enough red flags to make me suspicious. Not a full parade, but enough to pay attention." "How's your intimacy?" she asked, jotting notes. "It was great after our son moved out, but it slowed down about 6 months ago," I admitted. "I'd want it nightly if I could, but she's been distant." She nodded knowingly. "That's common. What about her behavior? Any changes in grooming or routines?" "Yeah," I replied. "She's more secretive, works late more often, and spends extra time getting ready. It's subtle, but it's there." She outlined their services, which included surveillance, tracking, and phone monitoring, though some methods brushed against legal boundaries. I hesitated before agreeing to proceed. "I just need the truth," I said. "Whether it's an ongoing affair or just occasional flings, I have to know." By Wednesday, I authorized surveillance. Even then, doubts lingered. Was I being paranoid? Was this all in my head? Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right. It took a month for the truth to emerge. The PI presented undeniable evidence of Sophie's infidelity, confirming my worst fears. While her betrayal devastated me, I knew what had to be done. Quietly, I began preparing my exit. I started moving personal belongings into the car, assembling an evacuation bag, and making arrangements for my departure. The house was already in my father's name, meaning Sophie had no claim to it. I felt a mix of anger and sadness as I walked through the home we had built together, memories tainted by her actions. Friday came, and I returned home at my usual time, expecting to find Sophie in the living room with wine and TV. Fridays had always been our time to unwind, ordering takeout, talking about our week, and often making love. But the house was eerily quiet, except for faint noises from the bathroom. I grabbed a beer and sat on the couch, waiting. When Sophie emerged, I was taken aback. She was dressed to the nines, wearing a colorful blouse, short skirt, stockings, heels, and styled hair with flawless makeup. She looked stunning, but it wasn't for me. "Oh, Ethan, I didn't realize you were home," she said, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "I'm home at the same time every day," I replied, my tone calm but cold. "You're dressed up. What's the occasion?" She hesitated, avoiding my gaze. "I have a date tonight, with John from work." It was a lie, and we both knew it. John, her coworker from the head office, was married with kids. I wasn't sure what she expected me to do. Beg her to stay? Confront her? I had no intention of doing either. I stood and met her eyes before walking to the kitchen. "Aren't you going to say anything, Ethan?" she called after me. "No," I said flatly. "Well, fair enough. I'll be back later, and we can talk then," she said, her voice unsure. She walked toward the door, glancing back with what looked like guilt or doubt. "Good night, Ethan," she murmured. "Goodbye, Sophie," I replied, my words heavy with finality. She hesitated, then left. As soon as the door closed, I acted swiftly. I loaded my evacuation bag and suitcase into the car. Using my phone, I canceled our shared credit card, paid off remaining debts, and transferred most of our joint savings into my account, leaving her enough for a couple of months' expenses. With the house legally in my father's name, Sophie would soon realize she had no claim to it. I made 3 important calls that night. First, to my father. She admitted it, Dad. She's on a date with John tonight. The plan starts now. Where are you heading? He asked. Adelaide. I've got a new job there for a year. After the divorce, I'll come back to Sydney. Got it. I'll keep your location private. Send me your address when you're settled. Drive safe, son. You've done nothing wrong. Find peace and move on. Thanks, Dad. I'll talk to you soon. The second call was to my daughter. When I told her, she broke down in tears. It was heartbreaking, but I reassured her of my love and promised to send her my new details once I was settled. Finally, I called my son. He took the news with calm stoicism. Mom's a cheat, he said bluntly. What about me? You'll always be my priority, I promised. This doesn't change that. When the calls were done, I looked around the house one last time. I wasn't just leaving Sophie. I was walking away from the life I thought we'd built together. I resolved to find John's wife and tell her the truth. Not out of revenge, just so she'd know. Ryan, this isn't some dramatic story. I told my son over the phone. This is real life. I'm heartbroken, but all I can do is wait for the divorce and rebuild my life. I'll only be 46. It's not too late to start over. Can she demand counseling? Ryan asked hesitantly. No. Australian laws don't work like that. As long as Sophie and I live apart for 12 months, I can file for divorce. I won't even have to attend court, though I will, just to make sure everything goes smoothly. And if she pushes for counseling? She won't win that fight, I replied firmly. I'll present the evidence. Let her try to justify herself in front of a counselor who sees photos of her affair. Let's see how they'd feel if they were married to someone like that. Ryan sighed. Okay, Dad. Just be careful. Courts can be unpredictable. Don't worry, son. I've prepared. I'll keep you updated as I go. I'm sure your mom will contact you, so be ready. Thanks, Dad. Take care of yourself. I'll keep in touch. That was it. I left Sophie a brief note on the coffee table. It explained my departure and mentioned that my father would be in touch with her regarding the house. No further explanation. I left my wedding ring next to the note, along with copies of the evidence, keeping the originals in case I needed them later. I had already told our children, so there were no surprises for them. Driving away from the house felt strange, liberating yet heavy with emotion. The weight of years of betrayal and love lingered, but I could feel it starting to lift. I booked a hotel outside the city to give myself time to plan my move to Adelaide. Over 2 weeks, I slowly made my way there, taking the scenic route and exploring small towns along the way. It was oddly therapeutic, giving me space to reflect and process what had happened. In Adelaide, my colleagues welcomed me warmly, showing me around and helping me settle in. I chose a modern apartment in North Adelaide, renting instead of buying, knowing I would likely return to Sydney after a year. Once I was settled, I shared my new address with my family. Lily called immediately, her voice bright and eager. Dad, I want to visit you as soon as I can. I miss you too, I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. Let's arrange for you to come out for a month. We planned her trip, and knowing I'd see her soon gave me a sense of hope. My son, meanwhile, was finishing his university studies, but promised to visit during Christmas, just a few months away. My father kept me updated on Sophie's actions. Did you know she didn't come home until the next morning? He asked during one call. Yes, I replied. The investigators had already reported back. They tracked her and John to a romantic dinner in the city, followed by a night at a hotel. Once they confirmed her actions, I settled their fees and ended their services. There was no need for further surveillance. Later, my father shared Sophie's reaction to my departure. She called hysterically after discovering the note, the evidence, and your absence. She's been calling the kids, her family, anyone who might give her answers. I had ignored all her calls, marking her emails as spam. A week later, I confronted her with the lease and house ownership documents, which confirmed she had no claim to the property. She had 3 months to vacate or face legal eviction. She's asked about you constantly, my father told me. About your family, your work, your friends. She's consumed by guilt. She knows she's thrown away a 20-year marriage. Has she offered any kind of explanation? I asked. Not really. She's remorseful, but only because she got caught. It's just like your mother, sorry for being exposed, not for the act itself. Cheaters always have excuses, I muttered bitterly. They tell themselves it's just physical, that it doesn't mean anything. I've had opportunities too, but I never strayed. I stayed loyal because I loved her. You did everything right, Ethan, my father said gently. Take time to grieve your marriage. Heal. And when you're ready, open yourself up to love again. There are good women out there, and you deserve someone who'll treat you right. Thanks, Dad. I'll try, I said, though the thought of starting over still felt impossible. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into my new role, traveling across South Australia to meet suppliers and visit stores. The distraction helped, and my bosses were impressed with my focus and results. They even suggested I consider staying in Adelaide long-term. On weekends, I explored the Barossa Valley, using the time to reflect and recharge. A month after settling into my new apartment, Lily arrived. At the airport, she spotted me and shouted, "Daddy," before running into my arms. Holding her again was the happiest I'd felt in months. We spent the next few weeks together. Even with work commitments, I made sure to prioritize our time. One evening, she brought up her mother. Mom's been calling me constantly, trying to explain herself. She says she didn't mean for any of this to happen. Reluctantly, I showed Lily the evidence. As she read through it, tears streamed down her face. How could she do this? She asked, her voice trembling with anger. She loves you, Lily. Don't let this change how you feel about her, I said, though I knew it would be hard for her to forgive. When it was time for her to leave, the goodbye was excruciating. We hugged for what felt like forever, neither of us wanting to let go. As her car drove away, the loneliness I had tried to suppress came crashing down. For the first time in months, I let myself cry. Still, Lily's visit had rejuvenated me. Daily calls with her, frequent chats with my son, and support from my siblings began to fill the void. My father kept me updated on Sophie's situation, while old colleagues from Sydney reached out, offering laughter and camaraderie that reminded me of better times. 6 weeks before Christmas, something unexpected happened. Bored and distracted, I wandered into the supermarket one evening. Strolling aimlessly through the aisles, I turned a corner and froze. Grocery shopping used to be something Sophie and I enjoyed together. We'd laugh, crack jokes, and goof around in the aisles. Now, it was just a necessary chore, and the joy had long since faded. As I reached for a bottle of salad dressing, I suddenly bumped hands with another shopper. "Oh, I'm sorry. I think I startled you," I said, stepping back. "No, it's my fault entirely. I didn't see you there," she replied with a smile. "Please take the bottle. I'll find something else." "But it's the last one," I said with a faint grin, unsure of why her presence made me bolder. "How about this? You take the bottle, and we grab coffee afterward?" She hesitated, caught off guard but not offended. Her soft touch and captivating blue eyes, framed by thin-rimmed black glasses, drew me in. "I'm Ethan," I said, extending my hand. Her smile lit up her face. "I'm Emily," she replied, her warm voice sending a flutter through my chest as we shook hands. Her skin felt soft, and for a moment, I forgot we were in a grocery aisle. "Do you often meet men in supermarkets, Ethan?" she teased. I chuckled. "No, this is a first. And are you single? If not, I'll retract my offer. But if you are, I hope you'll say yes." Emily tilted her head playfully, brushing her shoulder-length brunette hair behind her ear. "I'd love to grab coffee," she said. "Can I have your number?" After exchanging numbers, she texted, "I'll finish shopping in about half an hour and head home to put everything away. But I can meet you in a couple of hours if that works for you." "Are you local?" I asked. "Yes, I live nearby," she replied. "What about you?" "Same. I avoid long drives just for groceries," I joked. As she moved her cart forward, she lightly rested her hand on my forearm. "See you soon, Ethan." Her touch lingered, sparking something I hadn't felt in years. Once home, I rushed to put away my groceries, showered, and changed into something casual but presentable. I texted Emily to suggest a nearby coffee shop I frequented, and she replied that she loved the place too, wondering if we'd crossed paths before. The thought that we might have unknowingly been in the same room before intrigued me. When she arrived, she looked radiant, dressed in a simple sundress that felt slightly overdressed for coffee but undeniably stunning. I stood as she approached, a little nervous but trying not to show it. Over drinks, we talked and learned more about each other. Emily confessed that she was amazed by my confidence in asking her out at the supermarket. "When you touched my hand, Ethan, I felt something," she admitted, blushing. "I don't know if it was just me, but it wasn't like anything I've felt before." "It wasn't just you," I said, smiling. Emily shook her head. "I've read about connections like that, but I always thought they were just stories." Then, it happened. As she extended her hand, we shared a look and a smile. When I grasped it again, she whispered, "There it is. It's definitely not just my imagination." We avoided diving too deeply into our pasts, keeping the conversation light for a first date. Still, I noticed her bare left hand, though faint marks of a previous ring were visible. She told me she was 35, a kindergarten teacher who loved her job, and lived alone in a small apartment with a few close friends for support. "Oh," I said, feeling the age gap. "I'm, 45. Emily brushed it off easily. "Your age doesn't matter, Ethan. What matters is the kind of person you are." Her reassurance gave me the courage to admit my recent breakup. Her expression softened as she reached across the table to touch my hand. "I see the pain in your eyes," she said gently. "I've seen it in myself, too." "Is it that obvious?" I asked. Emily nodded. "It gets easier, Ethan. Eventually, the person who broke your heart won't matter anymore. And then, maybe, you'll meet someone who begins to mend it. It may take time, but it happens." "My father always says the same thing," I replied, comforted by her understanding. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," she said with a smile. After finishing our drinks, we walked to her car. I felt a bit uncertain. Should I hug her, kiss her, or just say goodbye? I opted for a hug, but as we embraced, I found myself reluctant to let go. She didn't seem to want to either. "Give me a ring this week, Ethan," she said softly. "I'd love to chat again." "How about tonight?" I joked. She giggled, the sound tugging at my heart. "Feel free to call anytime." That night, I did just that. Over the phone, we made plans for dinner on Friday. Emily's teaching schedule kept her busy, but she was eager to see me again. After hanging up, I felt like a teenager, practically dancing around my apartment. The next day at work, my upbeat mood didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues teased me, asking if I was seeing someone. Not wanting to jinx it, I mentioned my coffee date and the upcoming dinner, emphasizing that I preferred dating one woman at a time. For Friday, I chose a restaurant with stellar reviews, a cozy yet elegant spot that felt perfect for a second date. I dressed smartly, arriving a little early, only to find Emily already waiting. She looked nervous but beautiful. Without hesitation, I leaned in for a kiss, which she returned with a soft smile. "Wow," she whispered. "If that's how you greet me, I can't wait for our second date." As we settled into a private booth, conversation flowed effortlessly. Sharing appetizers and desserts with Emily felt effortless, as if time itself had slowed. The meal was outstanding, with attentive but unobtrusive service. The restaurant faded into the background as we laughed, exchanged glances, and dove deeper into each other's worlds. When the bill arrived, I settled it quickly and suggested we head to Holland's for another drink. Emily's immediate agreement came with a radiant smile, one that warmed something inside me I hadn't realized was cold. Holland's, a quiet bar with soft piano music, was the perfect choice. The low hum of conversation around us added to the intimate atmosphere. Emily sipped on a cocktail while I nursed a bourbon, savoring the moment. Then she tilted her head, her eyes catching the dim light. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" she asked gently. The question pulled me into vulnerability. I opened up about meeting her, about my kids and my career, and the path that led me here. I spoke of my father's struggles and the fractured relationship with my mother after their divorce, which made me see my own marriage in its crumbling state. Finally, I confessed the truth. I'm technically still married, I admitted, watching her closely for her reaction. We're separated, and I relocated to finalize the divorce. It's over in every way that matters, but if you see my actions as unfaithful, I won't hold it against you. Emily's expression softened, and she reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on mine. Ethan, she said, if I thought you were still holding on to your marriage, we wouldn't be sitting here. Relieved, I opened up about the difficulty of being away from my kids in Sydney. I miss them every day, I admitted. It's the hardest part of this. Emily's face grew thoughtful. I get it. I've been through something too, she said, her voice quieter. My ex-husband was charming at first, charismatic, even, but he was controlling, and I ignored the warning signs. My parents told me not to marry him, but I was 19 and in love with a man 6 years older. I didn't want to listen. She described how her marriage deteriorated. Her husband isolated her from her friends and family, forcing her to work while treating her as little more than a maid. If I bought something for myself, he'd call me irresponsible. If I came home late, he accused me of cheating. Nothing I did was good enough. It was always negativity, never a kind word. I doubt he could say anything good about you now either, I whispered, meeting her eyes. Emily's voice cracked as she continued. He became unstable. I knew he'd either put me in the hospital or completely break me. One night, in tears, I called my father and begged him to rescue me. He came with my uncles and friends. My ex tried to fight them off, but he couldn't stand up to men the way he could to me. Her father subdued him with one punch, and her family helped her move out that night. She filed for a restraining order and took steps to protect herself. It's been 7 years since the divorce, she said, her voice trembling. He has no idea where I am. I've barely dated, Ethan. Fear held me back. But then I met you. Emily's hand gripped mine as she said, you've awakened emotions I didn't think I'd feel again. I never felt this way for him, not once. When it came time to leave, I noticed her hesitation behind the wheel. I don't think you should drive, I said gently. She nodded, and I offered to take her home. Pulling up to her apartment building, I realized I had considered renting there before choosing my current place. At her door, she paused, looking uncertain. Taking the lead, I pulled her close for another kiss. I had a wonderful night, Emily, I said softly. I'd love to see you again this week. Any night works for me, she replied. I'm a pretty good cook. How about dinner? I grinned. I'm not bad in the kitchen myself. Let's make it a cook-off. Wednesday sound good? Perfect, she said, smiling. And I'll expect my nightly call. Tomorrow, how about the beach? I suggested. Her laughter was warm. I'd love that. At home, I settled on the couch with a beer, checking my phone. A message from Emily popped up. Had a great night, Ethan. Wanted you to stay, but let's take it slow. Agreed, I replied, though her next message struck me deeply. I'm tired of sleeping alone. Me too, I confessed. The next morning, Emily honked outside my apartment. As I climbed into her car, she joked, breakfast and the beach. You can thank me later. We spent the day basking in the sun and cooling off in the water. By the time we left, she hesitated again, her expression tender. Drinks? I asked. I don't want to leave, she replied softly. Why don't you grab some things and come back? Within minutes, I had packed a bag and was knocking on her door. Emily opened it with a laugh, pulling me inside. The next morning, she made breakfast, and we spent the day lounging around her apartment. The silence was comforting, a stark contrast to the tension and chaos I'd left behind. No rush, Emily, I murmured, pulling her closer. We have time. It was then I realized I was falling for her. Hard. I wanted to believe it wasn't just a rebound from my divorce, that this was something real. Though we didn't text much during the day due to her teaching schedule, we spoke every night. My coworkers teased me about my glowing mood, and I finally told my family in Sydney about her. My father kept me updated on Sophie, who was nearing the end of her time at the house but still searching for me. By Wednesday night, I was eager to see Emily again. She greeted me with a beautiful dinner, and her dessert struck a chord. They say the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, I joked, patting my belly. Emily leaned in close. I love you, Ethan, she whispered. Surprised but elated, I smiled. I love you too, Emily. Isn't it too soon? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Not at all, I replied firmly. From the moment I met you, I knew you were special. I want to spend my life with you. And if moving closer to my kids means we relocate, I'll do it. You're worth it. Her eyes glistened as she whispered, Are you sure? My heart says yes, I affirmed to Emily, squeezing her hand. Let's see where this goes. That night, Emily visited my apartment for the first time. She laughed at its bachelor-like simplicity, but noted how clean and tidy it was. This place suits you for now, she teased, understanding it was only a temporary residence. When the topic of marriage came up, she blushed and turned away, but I gently held her wrist and confessed, Emily, I can't remember feeling this much love for anyone since Sophie, not because of how she hurt me, but because of how fresh and real this feels. Maybe it's age and experience, but I love you, Emily Harper. Her response floored me. One day, I want to be Emily Carter, she whispered, her eyes shining. For the next few weeks, we were inseparable, spending nearly every night together at her apartment, which felt much warmer and more inviting than mine. I kept my kids updated on our relationship, but they wanted to meet Emily before we took any major steps. Before Christmas, I asked my son about his mother. I told her I wouldn't be there, he said bluntly. She probably knows you're not in Sydney either. Lily isn't talking to her much these days. Hearing that made my chest tighten. Despite everything, I hated that my children had to deal with the fallout of Sophie's actions. Are you sure you want to stay in Adelaide, Dad? Ryan asked. We're all considering moving here to be closer to you. Emily squeezed my hand in support, her silent reassurance strengthening my resolve. It's a big step, Ryan. Think it through, I replied. Trust me, Dad. You're more important, he said firmly. Emily glanced at me, her expression soft. I still need to go back to Sydney to finalize the divorce, I reminded them. Just don't rush it, Ryan cautioned. I won't, I promised. But leaving your mother was planned. It had to happen. To hell with her, he muttered, the bitterness in his voice clear. When Lily arrived at the airport with her husband, Jacob, Emily accompanied me to greet them. Lily rushed into my arms, just like she used to after school, tears streaming down her face. Introducing her to Emily was emotional, but the moment felt right. The next day, my son surprised me by showing up at my apartment. We embraced tightly, sharing an unspoken understanding. Emily remarked on how much he resembled me, though I laughed and said I'd already confirmed paternity. Later, I drove us all to Emily's parents' house, where we unloaded a trunk full of gifts. Her mother instantly adored Lily, treating her like family, and I was certain her parents welcomed Ryan like a grandchild. I video called my father to exchange Christmas wishes, watching as my extended family celebrated with him. Meanwhile, Sophie's life was unraveling. She had moved in with her parents after being ousted from her affair partner's life and facing repercussions at work. My kids documented parts of the day on social media, but I found little interest in keeping up with the updates. Christmas at Emily's family home was delightful. I surprised her with a beautiful necklace and bracelet, hinting at our future together. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she promised to wear them often. After a hearty lunch, her father handed me a beer, and we ended up in his garage tinkering with an old sports car. Emily seems happier lately, her father said, glancing at me. Leaving Adelaide might be good for her. Are you okay with staying here indefinitely? I'll stick around for her, I replied. Besides, my kids are considering moving closer too. How soon can you finalize the divorce? Probably a few months at most, I explained. Sophie's dragging it out, but I have solid evidence now. He shook his head, disgusted. I don't get it. Why get married if you can't stay faithful? Betrayed men. Ever heard of them? I nodded, understanding. It's a terrible cycle. Emily's been through her own version of it, but she deserves better. Just don't hurt her, Ethan, he said softly. She loves you. I love her more than anything, I said firmly, just as Emily appeared in the doorway, smiling at us. That evening, Lily drove us home, and Emily and I enjoyed a few quiet drinks before heading to bed. If Christmas was good, New Year's Eve was even better. I booked a downtown hotel where we had dinner, drinks, and champagne waiting in the room. As midnight approached, I asked her, "Any New Year's wishes?" "I want us to live here together," she said, pulling me closer. "Deal. And I want you to propose as soon as your divorce is final," she teased. "I'm already looking at rings," I admitted, her smile lighting up the room. "I want a baby," she whispered. "We'll start a family together," I promised, kissing her softly. My children left a few days later. Though it was hard to see them go, I explained my reasons for possibly staying in Adelaide. When I told my father the same, he promised to visit whenever he could. The following months were filled with happiness. Emily and I applied for a lease and moved in together. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. This was real life, but I had never been happier. We faced challenges, including the looming specter of my divorce and lingering trust issues, but we committed to open communication. Emily inspired me to be a better man. Her love encouraged me to buy an engagement ring before my trip back to Sydney. On the flight, Emily was more nervous than I was, aware of the potential difficulties ahead. At the airport, my father greeted us with my siblings and kids. We stayed at his house while the divorce proceedings unfolded. I had already filed the paperwork, but my lawyer warned me that Sophie was contesting it. "I haven't seen her in 12 months, I stated. "I've met all the legal requirements. I've been in Adelaide, and she hasn't been with me." "True," my lawyer replied, "but she may still argue. No judge will take her seriously or mandate counseling." "Is Emily your partner?" he asked. "Yes," I confirmed. Emily added confidently, "And once the divorce is final, we'll marry and start a family." The lawyer nodded. "I'll contact her lawyer." 3 days later, my attorney delivered unexpected news. Sophie is willing to sign, making it a joint petition. If you speak with her directly, the process will move smoothly. "My lawyer suggests I speak with her," I told Emily, as we sat together discussing the final steps of the divorce. Emily's expression was thoughtful, but her tone was calm. "You're with me now, starting a new chapter. Are you still angry at her?" I took a deep breath and shook my head. "Not anymore. Let her say her piece, and then we can finalize this and move forward. She's a part of my past, nothing more." The following week, the court date finally arrived. Once Sophie signed the papers, the judge would finalize our divorce, and I'd be free. It was hard to believe it had been over a year since she destroyed our marriage. I hadn't seen her since the night she left for her date, and I had no idea what to expect. Emily accompanied me to the hearing, offering the same unwavering support she had shown me since the day we met. Walking into the courtroom with her and my lawyer, I felt steadier than I expected. Sophie, on the other hand, looked shocked to see me arrive with another woman. Her eyes darted between Emily and me, trying to process what she was seeing. Ignoring her reaction, I focused on Emily, holding her hand to reassure her. She leaned into me, her presence grounding me in the moment. When I finally turned to face Sophie, I was struck by how much she had changed. She looked worn, her once confident demeanor replaced by something fragile. Life hadn't been kind to her since I left, but I had no sympathy. She had made her choices. "Speak up, Sophie," I said firmly. "Let's finalize this. I'm done living in the past." Sophie hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is she?" "This is Emily Harper," I replied without hesitation. "After the divorce, I'll propose to her. Soon, she'll be Emily Carter." Emily, ever composed, smiled and added, "And I'll gladly accept his proposal because I want to be his wife and the mother of his children. We've already started planning a simple wedding, and hopefully, I'll be pregnant by then." Sophie flinched, her pain evident. I saw the familiar flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew me well enough to know I wasn't bluffing. "You bounce back fast," she said bitterly, her words laced with resentment. "I wasn't the one who cheated," I retorted. "I remember the evidence, the lies, the betrayal. You didn't even fight for us. After 20 years, you showed me exactly who you were. We talked about fidelity, Sophie. I warned you before we married that I'd leave if you turned out like my mother. You made my decision easy." Her expression tightened, but I didn't stop. "Do you regret it?" I asked coldly. "Don't bother answering. You don't regret what you did. You regret getting caught. You regret losing everything." Her lawyer tried to interrupt, but I cut him off with a glare. If she has the right to speak, so do I. Sophie's voice trembled. I made a mistake. No, I said sharply. Treason isn't a mistake. It's a series of choices. Whether he seduced you or not doesn't matter. You slept with him, and that's when you stopped being my wife. Don't insult me by calling it just lovemaking. For most people, lovemaking means love. It should have been me, not some idiot from work. She looked down, silent. Emily leaned forward slightly. Just sign the papers, Sophie. Ethan has moved on, and so should you. We love each other and are building a life together. Sophie's tears began to fall. I didn't mean to, she murmured. I don't care, I replied bluntly. You're not my concern anymore. Her lawyer placed the papers in front of her. Sign them, he said simply. There's nothing left to fight for. With trembling hands, she picked up the pen and signed the papers. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, I'm sorry, Ethan. I'll always love you. Her apology felt hollow, meaningless in the face of everything that had happened. The woman I loved, the one who truly mattered, was holding my hand, her love and presence a constant reassurance. As we left the courtroom, Emily leaned into me. Are you okay? She asked softly. I'm better than I've been in a long time, I replied. Outside, my father, Grace, Ryan, and Lily were waiting at a nearby cafe. I motioned to them, and we decided to head to a pub instead. Over drinks, I recounted the events of the day. What did she look like? Lily asked, curiosity plain on her face. Pretty rough, I admitted. Emily smirked, definitely showing her age. Did she sign? My father asked. She did, I confirmed, raising my glass. It's over. The divorce is final. We all toasted to the end of that chapter of my life. My father nodded knowingly. I went through the same thing with your mother. I'm sure Sophie said what she needed to, just like your mom did with me. She used the same excuse, I said, shaking my head. It was just lovemaking. Why do they always say that? Lily mused. It's such a weak justification. Grace blushed but chimed in. If I want something, I turn to my husband. That's how it should be. We all laughed at her candidness, easing the tension of the day. Well said, my father praised. Those are words to live by. Emily smiled at me, her hands still resting in mine. For the first time in years, I felt truly free, ready to embrace the future with the woman I loved. I'm just relieved it's almost over, I admitted, sipping my drink. Infidelity is unforgivable. Grace, sitting beside my father, nodded thoughtfully. If you were younger, maybe you'd feel trapped, she said, glancing at him. But your dad always supported me, and I had the strength to leave when I needed to. We stayed in Sydney for a few more days, making plans with the family. Lily and Jacob decided to join us in Adelaide, while Ryan was still weighing his options but seemed likely to move as well. Surprisingly, my sister joined us for dinner, arriving alone with news of her own failed marriage. You can stay with us while you figure things out, Emily offered warmly, taking her hand. You're family now, and my family is yours too. I'm selling the house here and moving to Adelaide, I added, squeezing Emily's hand. Emily smiled, placing her hand on her stomach. We'll get a bigger house, with plenty of room for our growing family. How many kids do you want, Ethan? She asked playfully. As many as you want, Emily, I replied with a grin. I love being a dad. A month later, the official divorce decree arrived, marking the end of my marriage to Sophie Bennett. I never heard from her again. According to Ryan, her sole point of contact, she left Sydney within 6 months and relocated to Queensland to start fresh. After that, I stopped asking, and Ryan eventually stopped updating me. I had no interest in her whereabouts anymore. 2 days after receiving the papers, I proposed to Emily on the beach, surrounded by our families. She was so overwhelmed that she could barely speak before I slid the engagement ring onto her finger. 6 months later, we were married on the same beach, just a short distance from our new home. When I saw her walking down the aisle, her pregnancy was unmistakable. Yet, she radiated happiness as her father escorted her toward me and placed her hand in mine. Our smiles were uncontainable as we turned to face the celebrant. My dear ones, we are gathered here today Fast forward almost 20 years, and life couldn't be sweeter. Emily and I have been happily married for nearly 2 decades, cherishing every moment from our first date to our wedding day. 6 months after our return to Adelaide, both my daughter and son relocated to be closer to us. Lily is happily married and has blessed us with 3 grandchildren, while Ryan and his husband adopted 2 children of their own. A year after my divorce, my father and Grace also moved to Adelaide. My father spent nearly a decade with us before passing away peacefully. To ensure Grace remained supported, we built a spacious granny flat for her, where she could maintain her independence while staying close. My sister eventually moved in with us after her marriage ended, bringing her children along. With our support, she regained stability and later remarried, enjoying 15 years of happiness with her second husband. My brother, however, stayed in Sydney, maintaining a distant but steady relationship with our estranged mother. At 60, we received news of her passing. Despite our strained history, Emily encouraged me to attend the funeral. "We should pay our respects," she said. "It's about who we are, not who she was." Surprisingly, my mother had remarried and embraced her second husband's children as her own. While they knew of us, they were shocked by her reluctance to acknowledge the estrangement from her biological children. We refrained from explaining the reasons, as funerals aren't the time for such discussions. After paying our respects, we returned home to Adelaide, leaving Sydney behind for good. Within a year, my brother relocated to Adelaide as well, finally reuniting the family. Emily and I continued to expand our family, welcoming 2 boys and 2 girls. Our older children were thrilled to have siblings and often offered to babysit, though Emily and I rarely ventured out. Despite the chaos of a full house, our love remained steadfast. We never went to bed angry, and our bond only grew stronger over the years. Life was far from perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. Looking back on my past, particularly my divorce, some might argue that I should have tried to reconcile with Sophie. But what would have been the point? Leaving without a word hurt her more than staying ever could. Fidelity had been the cornerstone of our marriage, and she shattered that trust. While some advocate for second chances, I firmly believe trust can't be fully restored after infidelity. Suspicion and resentment linger, often leading to eventual divorce anyway. Instead, I chose to move on without her, finding my true soulmate in Emily. Meeting her at the supermarket that day felt like fate. Though I'm not religious, I can't help but think of those old-world myths about gods of destiny. "Are you ready, Ethan?" Emily's voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, stunning in a red ball gown. Even after all these years, she still took my breath away. "You still have that old charm," I teased, walking toward her. "Any word from the kids?" she asked, adjusting her earrings. "They're either on their way or getting ready to leave," I replied. "And the little ones?" "They'll be fine for the evening," I reassured her. "Unless they set the house on fire." Emily laughed, her eyes sparkling. "So, we have time to ourselves?" "Absolutely." She leaned in, her voice soft. "I love you, husband." "I love you too, wife," I replied, kissing her. "Here's to many more years of happiness." "I hope so," she said with a smile. "Let's make the most of tonight."